Welcome to Brave New Worlds, an evening of conversation with Amanda Leduc and Jael Richardson on the incredible settings and wonderful worlds of their new novels, The Centaurus Wife and Gutter Child, with me, Thea Lim. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to Another Story Bookstore, who is hosting us here tonight, and Andrew Gojia. Thank you to HarperCollins, especially Cindina, and thank you to Penguin Random House, especially Claire Pokerchuk. Before we get to our discussion, I wanted to acknowledge the land that Another Story is on and that I am broadcasting to you from tonight. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Reading a land acknowledgement necessarily makes us think of the stories we've been told about the places where we live and whose stories get silenced. We hope that tonight's discussion will give space for you to reflect on how, if you are a settler, you might better tell the whole story of where you live. So I am going to introduce our two authors for this evening, and I'm going to start by introducing Jael Richardson. Jael is the author of the memoir, The Stone Thrower, A Daughter's Lesson, A Father's Life, which was adapted into a children's book in 2016 and was shortlisted for a Picture Book Award. She's obviously also the author of Gutter Child, which Jael describes as a dystopian story of courage and resilience, and which has been tearing up the bestsellers list since its release in January. And if all that was not enough, she is also a book columnist and guest host of CBC's Q, and she is the founder and executive director of the Festival of Literary Diversity. And in 5 short years, The Fold has made space and community for underrepresented authors and storytellers where none of its kind existed before. It's one so vibrant that Canadian media has been forced to pay attention. And it's for this reason that I think of Jael as the embodiment of the sci-fi slogan, no future but what we make. And I'm going to introduce our author, Amanda, now. So let's see, is she going to come on? There you are. Amanda Leduc is a disabled writer and the author of 2 novels, The Miracles of Ordinary Men and the brand new The Centaurus Wife, as well as a nonfiction book, Disfigured, on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. She's been a finalist for CBC prizes, not 1, not 2, but 3 times, along with a host of other international prizes for both fiction and nonfiction. And Amanda is the Communications and Development Coordinator for The Fold. And last spring, along with Jael, she converted The Fold into an online festival basically overnight, immediately serving as a shining example for how to go virtual, as Amanda is an unfailingly generous community builder, and she will email you all her resources in a zip file within 4 minutes of you asking. She lives with her dog, Sitka, and she documents Sitka's terrifying manuscript maulings on Instagram, which I definitely would call a study in non-attachment. So welcome, Jael and Amanda. So what I thought that you could both do before we jump into our conversation would be for both of you just to give us the quick synopsis of your novels in case anyone hasn't had a chance to get their hands on copies yet. And of course, you all know that you can go to Another Story to get your copies of Gutter Child and The Centaurus Wife. Do you want to start us off, Jael?
Sure. So Gutter Child is a book I started after Stone Thrower, as soon as I submitted the manuscript for Stone Thrower. And it's a dystopia set in an imagined world. It follows the life of Elamina Madeleine Dubois. She starts the novel at 14. And the question I was trying to explore in this world is what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure. And so in this world, Elamina is a gutter child, but she has spent her entire life growing up on the mainland, raised by a mainland woman as part of a special project. And when her mainland mother dies at the start of the novel, she is sent to an academy where she has to figure out what it means to be a gutter child, whether that really applies to her, and how she feels about the community she was taken from as a baby. And so the novel really explores the kinds of questions you make when you discover that you are part of a system that's designed against you, the choices you make and the reasons you make them, and the consequences or opportunities that follow.
Thank you, Jael. Go ahead, Amanda.
So The Centaurus Wife is a post-apocalyptic fairy tale mashup, I guess you could say. And it follows two main characters, a woman named Heather and a woman named Tasha, who both end up in this city that sort of lives in the shadow of a mountain. At the beginning of the novel, Heather has just given birth to twins, and then the world is decimated by a meteor shower, and Tasha lives in another city initially and then comes to this new one as a survivor, as a refugee. And it's about sort of their friendship, not really friendship, relationship that they develop as they sort of band together trying to find a way to survive. Survivors in the city are trying to, survive throughout the winter that's coming and get food and all of these kinds of things. And meanwhile, while all of this is going on, there are weird things happening in the mountain that overlooks the city, and a very strange connection in particular that Heather has with the mountain and the beings that live there. And the book is about, in many ways, really it's a book about grief and the way that we find way through grief by virtue of community, and how we pull together in the wake of catastrophe, how we make new stories for ourselves, and how we use the stories that we tell one another as ways of moving through the world and sort of helping ourselves to go on.
Thank you so much. And I think it's clear from both of those descriptions that both of you have chosen to write into an invented space, but you're tackling topics that are painfully real. Some of them, more obviously would be things like systemic racism or climate crisis, but obviously so many other things that fall outside of those categories. So my first question is, why did you do that? Or more than this, more pressingly, why did it feel necessary or required to tell these stories in this way within this somewhat fabulous environment instead of using realism?
You want to go first, Amanda?
Sure. So I am more or less defaulting to a fabulous space now. I spent a long time in my sort of early and mid 20s learning how to write what I thought was, the necessary realist story that you needed to write in order to be taken seriously in Canadian literature. And it wasn't until I reached the end of my 20s that I really started exploring more of that fabulous sort of speculative type of literature and what that could do. And I found a lot of freedom in it. I found it very liberating just to be able to say, anything is going to happen in this story, anything that I want. And it's just about building this new and different world. And I set out, I wanted The Centaurus Wife to be a book about desire initially. And because my mind works the way that it works, I was thinking about forbidden desire specifically. And how does that come out in a story? And I was like, well, obviously it's about a woman who falls in love with a centaur. That's the kind of story that thinking about this question. And gradually it expanded and became a novel and became something else much more, not much more, but something other than a book about desire. It became very much a book about grief, which is kind of the shadow side of desire when you don't have something that you really want. So it was interesting that it turned out that way. And it started out as a weird novel and became weirder and weirder as it went on. And I think the freedom that I gave myself in being able to write in an imagined world makes it actually easier for me to tackle things that I'm really interested in, these questions of belonging, these questions of community, these questions of disability literature and what it means to be an outsider specifically. And it was really gratifying to discover that disability is actually something that has been explored in speculative fiction a little bit, and to revisit stories that I'd known when I was younger and see them through a disability lens. So all of which is to say, it's a space in which I think I primarily work now, but it's also a space that has a really rich tradition, and I feel really excited and grateful to those who've gone before me to be able to be writing in this space.
Can you tell us some of the key texts that you read that were dealing with disability and more of these kind of imagined spaces or speculative spaces?
I mean, I know it's like the old boys club, but you know, the Lord of the Rings in many ways is about a whole variation of outsiders, right? And what you have people from different groups, different marginalizations, if you will, coming together to go on a quest. The work of writers like Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin were also really pivotal in terms of just thinking about what a world looks like when it's not our world, and what are the freedoms and the responsibilities that you have as a writer to create a world that, you know, looks different from our own, yes, but also operates outside of the confines of our world, right? I think there's a real tendency in fantasy to harken back to what we know of as medieval times, you know, that sort of knight and castle kind of era of fantasy, without really thinking about what it actually means to create and build a world that is different. So a world that is not, you know, misogynist or ableist, or all of the kinds of things that do tend to creep into other kinds of fantasy that we see. So I think that, you know, has been really, really pivotal in terms of my discovery of myself as a writer anew over the last, I'd say maybe 5-10 years, you know, revisiting those old texts and like this new way of seeing.
Yeah. And I think there's something very liberating and kind of revolutionary about looking at, like you say, those old boys texts and sort of saying, actually, you were writing for me, whether or not you intended to. Yeah. And Jael, this is your first novel. So I'm really interested to hear if you think of yourself as a writer of the speculative, or if it's kind of just where the story took you.
Well, I think part of it was a reaction to writing memoir. I had been so rooted in research and fact and real places that I was like, nothing. I want nothing to do with facts. I want to invent everything. I want to describe the sky as purple. Everything. I felt like a natural rebellion from being so grounded in fact. But I also think, as I've spent time working on Gutter Child, and certainly my next novel will also be dystopia, I think that dystopia allows a powerful place for talking about Black identity in particular. I was really influenced by Toni Morrison's Sula, which is a dystopia that is similar to Gutter Child in some ways, but is much more, takes place in one particular space. And I was really fascinated with what that book got me to think about just by reading it, and the ways in which talking about a place that wasn't somewhere in the States or anywhere where I hadn't been, and therefore something I had to kind of feel removed from. It was a place that was nowhere, and therefore everything in the book was all that I needed to understand. And so for me, dystopia gave me freedom. I could create everything. And then it also gave me this opportunity to look at the Black community more fluidly, rather than being divided by borders or nation. I could think about Black identity in particular, and colonization as it's impacted the Black community in particular, through the lens of gutter people and soci people and the people in the Hill. And it gave me just this flexibility to think about the issues and not be rooted in like, what do people from X place feel like, and what do people from this place feel like, and how do I make that work in the space? I also think, I just think dystopia lends itself to a good place of imagining for Black identity and for marginalized communities in a really special way. And I loved, Gutter Child was for me a bit of a sociological experiment. I felt like, I was building this world that was really messed up and designed so. And then I was throwing my characters inside of it to see what kinds of choices they would make and to see what kinds of opportunities they would have. And for me, I actually think my dystopias are always going to land on the border of realism. I'm not going so far in terms of what the world is and does, because it's I don't know how to do that, to be quite honest. Like when I read The Centaurus Wife, I'm like, oh my gosh, Amanda, this is so awesome. How do you do this? So I'm really hovering on that border of of realism, and then throwing my characters into situations and then solutions that also have to be real to me. So that's one of the interesting things that happened in Gutter Child, is I got to a point where I was like, I've made a world so difficult, I don't know how realistically to get them out or to figure a way out.
Mhm.
And initially
Mhm.
that was kind of my goal, like send them in and then figure out a way to fix it. And by the time I got to the end, I was like, oh, I don't know if this is, I don't know realistically how to fix this world. And it taught me a lot. I mean, I was writing the ending in the midst of last spring. And, you know, there were a lot of parallels that I was able to pull from. And that was both helpful and hard at the exact same time.
Mhm. Yeah, it's almost like you can draw a line between kind of social realist dystopia and, I don't know, dystopia, where often what I think both the writer and the reader wind up finding is that there is no way out, but that's sort of the point, and that's why it becomes such an interesting imaginative space. And I think in that sense, when I think about both of your novels, what I find really admirable about them is that they're both very careful to indicate that in any system of power, there are many different levels of oppression. It's not like there's just people who have stuff and people who don't have stuff, and they're on sort of either divides. And that's why I would call them sort of social realist speculative fiction, because you're so careful to show all the striations that there are within these categories. So, for example, as you said, Jael, in your description, Elamina, she lives in the sort of privileged mainland, but then she goes to a boarding school, which is less privileged. And then we also see how people live in the least privileged space within the universe of the novel, in the gutter. And the Centaur's Wife, in a different way, but a way that I felt like was very parallel, it sort of questions which species really is at the center of the world by showing us all the different planets that kind of exist on our planet, as it were. So there's the human world, the natural world, and the mystical world. And all of them endure the privations of industrial society in different ways. It's not like the centaurs don't have to deal with the impacts of late capitalism, really. And so that makes your books so rich and intricate, and that's what makes them feel, I think, real. So I wanted to know, how did this multi-level approach come into your novels? It's funny hearing you say to Amanda, Jael, like, how did you do that? Because I guess that's sort of the question I'm asking both of you. Where did this come from? How did you do it?
A lot of crying.
There's a lot of text messages back and forth. Yeah.
Were you working on your novels simultaneously? Like, did you start them around the same time? And was that like a pact?
I feel like when we met, we must have both been working on them, but we weren't like, obviously we didn't start out as besties. So I don't think we were talking about our books in great detail at the beginning, but I did feel like our work at Fold necessarily needed to include conversations about writing. And I've been quite open with Amanda and Ardo as well now, that reading and writing are actually a part of our work days, that we have to find ways to develop our craft and consume reading, because that actually feeds the work we do at Fold as well. And it shouldn't be something that you then have to like squeeze only into the corners of your weekend. So I mean, we don't really know how we're doing this. We're just kind of winging it as we go. But we did talk a lot about our writing, particularly in the summer, in the off season when we were able to work on it. I felt like there were always conversations. I mean, Amanda's my go-to when I'm like, I don't know what to do. I call her. But I guess I'll answer the question, because
I like that the answer to the question is I call Amanda. So
yeah, that's probably that's the answer to most of my life questions, is call Amanda. But one of the things in terms of creating those differences was really important to me in Gutter Child. For me, one of the critical parts of the story is the different ways that different characters navigate the world, and the ways in which the privileges and difficulties that they face impact those decisions. So the main characters is, Elamina, and then there's Josephine, David, Violet, and Rowan. And each of them have arrived at the school at different points and with different aims, goals, purposes, etc. And that shapes all of the decisions that they make. If you look at where their lives take them, so much of it is influenced, I think, while I don't explicitly talk about gender shapes what they do. Oh, I do explicitly talk about that. Gender shapes what they do, and how they arrived, how much time they spent in the gutter before they came there, and with what purpose they came there, all shapes their decisions. And when over the course of the story, you see how class, levels within the Soci community, which is the original inhabitants of the land, how that impacts the opportunities that are available to them, who pays attention, who doesn't, who gets overlooked, who gets opportunity, who doesn't. All that comes into play. And I think it's really important. I remember being at an event at Eden Mills, actually, and I was interviewing Wab and Omar El-Akkad. And there was a question from someone in the audience about disability and how disability is represented in dystopia, that in order to do a really thoughtful dystopia, you have to really think about all the different communities and how they're being treated in these spaces. Because if you don't, you essentially say that they've been wiped out, that they, and so that was really not something I hadn't thought of before, but something I thought of in a new way and with new kind of pressure and strength to say, I have to, and there are all kinds of communities that are not named, but that I thought about very distinctly as I was writing it. I didn't want to name them as like, check, I covered this, but I did want to think about where trans folks might sit, where queer folks might sit. And I did think about that as I was building the world. And so I think that's important as well. Some things are more obvious, some things are more spoken of, but that was also kind of intentional.
And I think it's really important to think about how thinking about all these different groups who experience marginalization in a different way when you're trying to write a dystopia is not just about being woke or sort of identity politics, but it's actually a world building hack. Yeah. Like it makes your novel on a very objective level better because you've thought about, all the different kind of pockets of society and how they work. You're not just thinking about one type of person.
Yeah, and I think that's it's the fullness of the world, right? It's thinking about all the corners of it and how it exists. And I think it's important to know that. I mean, there's always the rule with dystopia. And when you're writing a novel, you may not address it, you may not talk about it outright, but you need to know in your own mind what the answer to that question is. And that was a really important thing to me, is to think through, the communities I work with at Fold and that we get to work with all the time and say what does it look like in this world for that group, whether they're gutter folks or mainlanders, how is that played out? And, it's not a soapbox situation where I'm trying to fix everything or talk about everything, but I'm trying to think about everything for sure.
So how did you think about everything in the creation of your novel, Amanda?
I think when I was really trying to be conscious of the fact that this was like the pressure cooker to end all pressure cookers in many ways in the novel, because you have essentially a small group of people, a scattered group of survivors, some who are sort of have grown up in this city in which they find themselves, and other people who come to it through virtue of trying to escape other places. And I was just really conscious of the ways in which, these are people that maybe some of them know each other and some of them don't, and it kind of all thrown together. And so I guess I was thinking about everybody on a very sort of individual level. And one of the things that's interesting to me that I've been, now that the book's out in the world and more people have been reading it and people have been, identifying with various characters in various ways, and finding, someone said in an Instagram review that the book just seemed full of real people who are, neither too bad or too good. They're just kind of normal people kind of going along and making mistakes as they go. And that was really interesting to me because I wanted to make sure, I think Heather is obviously a disabled character in the book, but there are many other disabled characters in the narrative as well. And I really wanted to be conscious of the fact that for the disability community and the disability narrative in particular, there's sort of traditionally two ways that it can fall. You're either, a beatific Tiny Tim, or you're an evil villain. And we all know that people, do not fall easily into those two camps. So I really wanted to think about, when I was thinking about communities in the book and building a community of these disparate kinds of people, what it meant for them just to be people and individuals in their own right, in their own way. And I think, because it was just a really small cast of characters, it was easier for me to do it. I still struggled a great deal in pulling it together. And, it went through multiple drafts before it arrived at the point where it's at now. And I think if I had been working with a lens that was a little bit more pulled out, I would have found it even more difficult than it was. And I think too, with the Centaurus Wife, there's a certain amount in the book of working with metaphor, and it was important to me to be writing metaphors that weren't perfect and that could, through virtue of being imperfect, be applied to a lot of different situations. You know, the centaurs sort of exist in this liminal space where they're sort of half human and half animal, but, you know, they don't really feel like they fit in either. And that was really important to me as someone from the disability community, because, you know, I have able-bodied passing privilege and can access most able-bodied spaces. So sometimes I feel like a disabled imposter, but also my limp is quite visible. And, you know, there are like fatigue and other things that come into play that make my movement through the able-bodied world difficult at times. So there is that pull, and it's been really gratifying and really lovely to hear that that pull has also echoed for other people and other communities who likewise see themselves as existing between two distinct spaces. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah. Yes, wonderfully. And that's, I feel you've used the word easy twice now, Amanda, and I love the fact that when writers use the word easy, it means like 75% impossible as opposed to like 95% impossible. Like that's what easy is, you know? You know, and I think on that train of thinking about those characters in your novel who are sort of neither good nor bad, one of the things that I love most about the Centaur's Wife, and I just really couldn't get enough of, was how angry and bitter Heather was. I was like, this is fantastic. And it's just like such a reproach to exactly what you say, that kind of beatific Tiny Tim character, whose only choice is just to be an inspiration to everyone. Like that's all that they get to do. But aside from, however, we might be thinking about the representation of disability, it also just made Heather a really gripping character. Like I was like, yes, you know, who are you going to kick down now? I want to see it. But it struck me that in thinking about that both your books are interested in rage, but also the opposite of rage, which is kind of, I guess we can think of it maybe as surrender. And when I think about that in the context of Gutter Child, I think of the character May, who's kind of a more minor character, but there's a scene with Elamina that was really striking to me where May is essentially someone who's kind of heartsick. Like she's not going to prioritize, she's not going to rise up even at great personal cost to her, because she just can't get over the devastation of what she's living through. And Elamina is almost kind of disgusted by her and frightened of her, because she says something like, is her incurable sadness contagious? So for both Elamina and Heather, getting mad or giving in are actually connected to how they stay themselves, because there's many aspects of their situations that they cannot change, right, that are not going to change, but they still want to figure out, well, how do I be me in this intractable situation? So what would you say is the role of rage or surrender in the situations of your novels?
I was kind of obsessed with this question because I think so much of what we're told is that when the system is stacked against you, you've got to fix it. You've got to fight it. You've got to like push back. And I just thought, I don't think that's how most people function. I don't think we go about life tearing things down that are wrong. We often either just come to a peace about it. Like, this is my world and this is how I will find happiness in this world. Or we actually like sit under it. Like we really become overwhelmed by it. And I think May is an example of someone who becomes truly overwhelmed. And at times Elamina does as well. And what I wanted to explore was how you realistically live in a system that fails you, how you go about day to day functioning, because we live in a system that's designed to fail, most of us, many of us. You know, colonization has messed us all up in various ways. And yet it is how we will live, most of us, for the rest of our lives, in some version of capitalism and colonization and all the terrible things that come from those things. And so it's, for me, like, what does day to day look like when you're in this system? Are you angry all the time? If you're not angry, what do you do about it? And you know, what happens with either of those decisions. Because I think there are characters who are angry, who do things about it, Josephine for sure. And there are characters who, I was really interested, you know, when I look at Ida and I look at even the girls in Riverside, and I look at different situations in the story, there are characters who find ways to function and then protest in small ways, little decisions to do this or not to do this. You know, Ida isn't going to have children, and she makes that choice because the system will fail the children she would bring into the world. And for me, that's her act of protest. That's her rage. And so that's I again, that idea of realism, I was trying to think about realistically when we're in these spaces, what do we do with our rage? And that's been a big, I mean, that's got me fascinated, to be honest. Even as I reached the end of the book, I was like, this is fascinating. What do we do now? Because yeah, I think how do we live day to day with rage? Most of us are feeling rage right now, rage at institutions, at systems that were in place well before COVID, at systems that are failing us in extra ways through COVID. I think we're all in states of rage, and yet every day we have to wake up and function. And so I think it's a really, you know, writing is a great way to kind of move that around on the page.
And the thing about rage is that I think it's seen as kind of a problem that needs to be fixed, or maybe something that's unreconciled, right? The idea is that you're in a space where you have to get over it. And that's kind of sort of what, you know, Heather's partner says to her, like, you know, you're so in Amanda's novel, you're, you know, so angry and you have to let your walls down. And I think what I found really interesting about Heather, and I wonder if you'll agree with this, Amanda, was that she's sort of like, this rage is not a problem to be fixed, actually. So if we think about everything that Jael says, kind of about the daily practice of rage, Heather's a really interesting character in that sense. She's just like, no, I'm good.
Yeah. You know, it's so funny, Thea, because this happened with Heather, and then it also happened with Tasha too, where you came with this question about rage, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, because yes, obviously Heather is angry, but I didn't think of her as filled with rage so much as I thought about her as just being exhausted all the time, exhausted, dealing with, I mean, on a physical level, she's just given birth to twins and the world has literally ended. So, you know, she's trying to keep it together. But also she's just exhausted from living in this, you know, mountain city with these people who are, you know, kind of friendly to her, but also kind of not. You know, she was in school, this whole idea of, you know, she's sort of treated as this outsider within her own city. And even her husband, you know, she's very wary of him. They have this bond because they have these children together, but she's unsure about how to navigate it. And she puts up walls as a result of this, you know, and she makes mistakes as a result of this anger. And her husband coming to her and saying those things, I think, you know, it was coming from a real place of pain for him, because he really sees how in her rage and her exhaustion, you know, she's walled herself off from paths that he sees could, you know, move her to a better space of wellness, or move her to a place of comfort, right? But what he doesn't get is that she's living in a different world than he is living in, and she has always been living there, right? And Tasha, someone read the book a couple of weeks ago and said, oh, you know, I was really struck by Tasha, the narcissistic leader of these single writers who band together. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I never thought of Tasha as a narcissist, but she is, right? She does make some very narcissistic decisions. She has some very narcissistic behaviors. She sort of swoops in and just kind of starts making decisions on behalf of all of these people who are left here. But it's also, you know, this is a tool that she's using to cope with her grief, to cope with her own trauma that she's dealing with, in much the same way as Heather's rage is a tool that she's using both to sort of, you know, as a shell to protect herself from the world that's going on around her. And then also as something that sort of keeps her going. And I think, coming back to the rage in particular, there is that, you know, that sense of Heather existing in a system, in a city that was built on a system where she was not, you know, she's always sort of been this outcast who's been physically disabled, and then, you know, they're like, her father was also an outcast in his own way, and there were all these rumors about him being crazy and being, you know, mentally unwell and all these kinds of things. She's grown up under the shadow of that, and no one around her has made an effort to change those things, right? So she finds solace through being an outsider, through being, you know, reaching for other dreams and reaching for other spaces. And I think part of her anger too is about the fact that she has to have one foot in this real world where she lives, this mountain city, when she also wants to be elsewhere. She wants to be inhabiting an entirely different plane of life and plane of existence, and she can't, right? Like that's not an option that's available to her. And it seemed very natural to me to be exhausted with having to straddle that all the time. Yeah, when I mean, I certainly can't be angry all the time. And increasingly what comes in the place of that anger is exhaustion, you know, just being tired about having to make those decisions of like, what do you do in the day to day to move yourself forward? But there's also a real beauty in that too. And that part of the narrative of the book and part of the thrust of the book is recognizing that sort of strange, unwieldy, terrible work of survival, and the terrible beauty that exists in making those kinds of small decisions that kind of get you through, right? It's not necessarily a narrative that ends, much like Jael's, right? These are not narratives that end with happy Hollywood endings, because I think the questions that they're grappling with and the realities and the systems that both books are grappling with are things that don't make for happy endings. There are happy moments for sure. But ironically enough, I think happy endings in the context of these two very unrealistic novels is also unrealistic.
And I think there's something very daring about what both your books do in leaning into the fact that things are unfixable. And the reason why that's daring is because we're working within a form, fiction and storytelling and narrative, that wants to lean towards resolution. And I think that we're going to see, we already see a lot of that, and I think we're going to see more and more of it in our COVID and post-COVID times, you know, so I think this is just the beginning.
I think there's a real desire, if I could just say.
Yeah.
There's a real desire, and this, you know, for me goes back to fairy tales, right? And the sort of history of fairy tales and folk tales that we tell to children and to ourselves as adults. There's this real desire to simplify the world because the world is so strange and terrible and heart-wrenching. And, you know, so many things don't get worked out in this real world in which we live. And there's a real desire to retreat from that in stories, I think, where you can, you know, have a happy ending where someone falls in love or someone, you know, overcomes experience distress. And I think there's a real question for me as a writer about that work of forcing your reader to just kind of sit in what's uncomfortable and sit in the fact that some narratives are not going to end happily, and sometimes terrible things. I mean, there are terrible things that happen in The Centaurus Wife, and you know, I wrestled with putting them in there because they are so dark, but the reality is the human capacity for wrestling with what's dark and emerging in some way, shape, or form is quite boundless. But you don't necessarily emerge unscathed, right? You emerge looking entirely different from the person that you were before. And what magic exists in that kind of transformation. I'm really interested in that. And even though it's speculative arena, I think those are questions that I, for one, am, you know, constantly asking myself now in the pandemic landscape in which we find ourselves, looking at the real world implications of having a disabled body in a world that's making, you know, in Canada, all kinds of decisions around assisted dying and legislation and that sort of stuff. These questions of rage and exhaustion and power in confronting what's uncomfortable become really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Jael, did you find that there were things that you maybe thought twice about putting in the book because they were challenging or difficult for the reader, but that maybe wound up making it in or not making it in because they did enable you to sort of wrestle with, sort of get down to where you really needed to go?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like I have as much control over where the story goes as I would always have liked to think. I think the story kind of leans into you and you're supposed to write it, right? Editing, you can have a bit of control over, but like the story itself kind of comes to you and pushes you in a direction that you don't have as much say over as you might think. And so the question became in the editing process, like, some of the difficult moments, I felt particularly badly about giving them to the world during this crisis, this moment in time. And I actually added that note at the beginning, because at the beginning of the book, just to warn people, like, this is about a system of oppression and therefore people respond in ways that are difficult. So like, take care with your heart and your mind, pause as needed as you read this. And I did it because it was almost like a bit of an apology. Like, I'm sorry, I can't write happy books and romance and like things where great things happen and hope abounds. Like, I'm sorry, I can't give you that book, but here you go. And yet, so there was that. And it was interesting this week, a woman, she had received the book in a book box and she read the note and actually posted like, guys, how serious is this? My mom's dying and I don't know if this book is safe for me. Like, I don't, and I actually wrote to her and I said, look, like, it might not be the right time. You might want to put it away and read it later. And I think that's fair. I think people a book finds you at the time it's supposed to find you, and you can put a book down and pick it up later if it's not the right time, if you get to a point. I know a couple of people who, my friend describes herself as an empath, who said, like, I had to put it down a few times. And I think it's really important to do what you need for yourself. The one thing I will say is it does bother me a little bit when people are like, this book is so traumatic or it's so heartbreaking, because I think, that's, I don't think it's, I think it's real, honestly. And I think that for people who've lived this life, whether you're a racialized person or from a marginalized community, and you read it and you see yourself in parts of it, your life is not traumatic. Your life just is. And so when people say it's so traumatic, it's so heartbreaking, it's so this, and they put this heaviness on it as though that applies to everyone, it says a lot more about them than I think it does about the book. And so I think it's really important. I think a lot of times we see books as heart-wrenching or traumatizing or devastating, especially when they're by racialized or marginalized communities, because we pity them and because we don't know the day-to-day. And I have found people, like I was at a school event recently, and one of the teachers, a Black woman, was leading, and she was talking about the moments of joy that she loved in the story. And if you are looking, you will see joy. You'll see moments of joy. You'll see moments of community in both of our books. But if you're looking, if you're weighed down, or maybe there's a bit of pity, maybe there's a bit of distance between the experience, it can feel traumatic. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to unpack it and understand what happens when you project that on other readers and you label a book that way. Because I've seen a number of books where, no offense, like white people, able-bodied people are just murdering up the whole place. And people are like, it's thrilling, it's intense, it's captivating. Like, you got to understand what's happening there. It's not just, these books are sad and these books are not sad. Sad things are happening in both books, but where are you coming from that gives you a perspective of pity or
and I just think that idea of a book that helps us to see how we see is, so powerful and amazing. And I would say both your novels are books like that. We are, believe it or not, we are running out of time. Our Q&A box is filling up, and I do want to get to a few audience questions, but I did want to ask you one last question before I looked in the Q&A box, which is really sort of a question for myself. We've heard both of you talk about how much, a little bit about how much you sort of turn to each other as you were writing these novels, and writing friendships are vital. Whenever I talk to writing students, actually, that's one of the things that I say. I'm like, talk to each other, don't talk to me. but they're also tricky, right? Because the nature of the market is that it's the only engine through which to reach readers, really. And the nature of the market is that it pits us against each other. So I'm wondering, do you have tips for writers managing friendships under late capitalism?
Friendships under late capitalism. Next book, Taya. There you go. It's really tricky. I was thinking about this question earlier today and yesterday, actually, because, you know, I'll be honest and real here. The worst I have ever felt as a writer has been when I have been envious of fellow writers' success, because it almost never happens around writers that I don't know. You know, I can look at the success of other writers and just sort of, all right, you know, that book's not for me, whatever. But sometimes it's been really, really difficult to watch the success of friends in particular. And it has nothing to do with them almost. It's like, I'm happy for them. It says so much more about me and my own self-confidence in myself as a writer, right? Where it's like, you have this idea that it's, you know, you're operating in, what is it called? A system of scarcity, where there's only so much to go around. And if someone has X, that means that you will never have the opportunity to have X. And I think the thing that has, you know, and it's something that I still struggle with, but I'm much better at it now. And I think part of the reason for that is that I learned how to build a community for myself and a space for myself that was actively involved in writing and actively involved in the community, involved in things that I was really enjoying, that were, but also weren't directly connected to the work that I was putting out into the world, right? So the writing became and has become this very important part of a life, which also has other parts, which are really rich and fulfilling. You know, my work with The Fold has become a huge part of that, working with Jael and sort of, you know, watching Jael's many wonderful strengths is the way that she really can help you see your own strengths. And, you know, having that has been a huge gift in being able to rest on that and then look around and see, actually, we don't live in a system of scarcity. You know, there is so much to go around for everybody, and books find their readers, right? Regardless of where those readers are. You put a story out into the world and there will be people who resonate with it. And so that has been a real revelation for me. And the thing that I find myself saying to other writers now, more often than not, is, you know, as much as you put energy into your writing and focus on your writing and your craft, put as much energy into creating a community for yourself, because your community will always be there. You know, the accolades that may or may not come with the writing may or may not happen, but your community will be something that you can always come back to and always participate in. And it's not always easy. You know, it comes with its difficulties, because you do still have those situations, right, where someone gets praised or gets lauded and you don't, or vice versa. But I think the constant of that is that you're all here, you're all working toward this thing together and doing these things together. That's been a huge help for me. However, you know, it could totally change in years' time when I'm wrestling with my next manuscript and feeling like it's never going to go anywhere. Yeah.
Well, I love that. I feel like you have given us a lot of tools and have also acknowledged that, like other things we've talked about, it's also in some ways an unfixable problem, which I think shows a lot of self-compassion.
I think for me, first of all, Amanda knows where all the bodies are buried, literally, in my life. So
I can't say, because if I did say, then another one of those bodies would be mine.
Yeah, but in truth, like, Amanda hears all, like, my jealousy, my envy, my rage, my happiness. She knows, like, all the books that make me feel all those things, all the authors that make me feel those things. She could end me. She could ruin me, I swear. Because I need someone to talk about it with, because honestly, oftentimes I don't understand what I'm feeling until I say them out loud.
Yes.
And my husband's not a reader. He's not helpful in this regard. And so I call Amanda and I tell her how I'm feeling. the hardest thing and the trickiest thing, I think, has been now when both of our books are coming out, and it's really hard to know. I mean, I think I tell Amanda everything. I don't know how much she tells me, but I tell her everything. And I think there's been, we've been really good about it. I think, like, there was a point, I'll give an example. Amanda was invited to a festival really early and was the first one of us to get invited to a festival. And I was like, oh, fine. It's okay. They're dead to me. It's fine.
Don't call me.
We just kind of joked about it. And so there's stuff like that we just kind of like take it easy. I think we've talked a lot about award season, and actually we talked about award season last year. We're like, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? Will we go, like, our plan?
We haven't figured it out.
We still haven't figured it out. Our plan was to go on a vacation around the time the announcements were happening, when it was like a different time zone. So we wouldn't even know, like, what time is it anyways? I don't know. So we don't really know how we're going to handle all of that. But I will say I will be infinitely more excited to see Amanda on the lists than I would be to see my own book. It will feel just like the best. And I'll say this, it's because I get so much recognition and acknowledgement from Fold and from the work of quote unquote starting and founding Fold, which I've realized I might change that, because Amanda's been at the Fold from so long now that she is like as founding, you know, in a sense. She's been there since the very first festival, and so many people attribute me to being the Fold and the face of the Fold because I'm loud and I talk a lot and all that good stuff. But Amanda,
you talk so beautifully.
But Amanda is the brains, like, is the machine that keeps Fold moving. I can get all over the place with like what I'm doing, what I'm thinking, my family life, nuts. And Amanda, no matter what her family life is doing, no matter what she's going through, she finds great, like, she's so disciplined, and she will just go and work and execute. And some of that's from a good place, some of that's not. Amanda, you need to relax sometimes. But I think it's so hard for me to see her undervalued and underrepresented in the Fold community. I think Fold people get it and know Amanda and appreciate it, because if you've ever been to Fold, Amanda's the one that's emailing you 700 times to do your stuff. So you know that Amanda's the machine that keeps it going. But outside of that, I would love to see Amanda just like put on the pedestal that she deserves. And so, you know, award season, I am going to be like this to the Centaurus Wife, like this all the way, because I would just, it would make my life. And if it doesn't happen, I will just take her out and make an award myself.
I would like for award season to be like Romeo and Michelle's high school reunion, but with me and Jael just going around
head and everything. Yeah, that's it.
Parts of the country. Jael knows where all the bodies are buried, and I know where all the spreadsheets are. This is right.
Oh, okay.
We work so well together. I think you don't
have to say anything, Amanda. You just say, yes, I'm amazing. That's all. Yes, I'm amazing.
Yes, I'm amazing. But Jael is also amazing because she helps people realize how amazing they are. And that, I think, is a real, it's something that we don't talk about enough in the literary community, right? Like there's not enough, we talk about jealousy a lot. Yeah, we don't talk about what it means when you lift other people up, right? Those are the kinds of questions. And again, you know, we sit in uncomfortable things, sit in literary jealousy and talk about it and see what it is at the core of it, but also what are you doing to lift yourself up out of that by lifting up others, right? And Jael is so good at that. And there's so many of us in CanLit who owe Jael everything. And I am definitely one of those people. And look at this, we're just like,
let's go. Question and answers, other people's questions.
So I was going to say, I feel like after watching this back and forth, all of us are going to hope that your Romeo and Michelle award season trip is live streamed. So please do that for us. Okay, here we go.
At that point, yes, we will film it in hotels and just.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will be tuning in. So here is a question from Therese. What has world building for an alternate dystopian or apocalyptic society taught you, if anything, about how to navigate this world right now?
Ooh. Well, I have answered this question twice today, so I will start by saying I realized when I got to the end of this book that I was not very hopeful, honestly, that things were going to change. I'm not very hopeful or optimistic that systems change at all or dramatically. And so, like, when you look at the Constitution or the documents that are sort of our founding father documents that were built with founding fathers in mind, they're not easily torn down. They're not easily changed. And writing this book taught me that. When I built a world, and when you build it well, it's not easily destructed or deconstructed. And so that made me feel like, well, that's a heavy way to live. And what I had to realize is part of being an activist in the real world is recognizing the sphere of influence that you do have control over, where you can make change. That I have read books that have changed me and changed the way I relate to others and the way I relate to people. It's helped me build bold. And I have written books in which people have said, I've changed the way they see the world and the way they navigate things. And so for me, it just reminded me of the importance of stories as changing small worlds, maybe not big systems, but small worlds.
Did you want to answer that one, Amanda? I feel like that leads into some of the things that you've already said about, small changes.
Mostly Jael's answer, just, everything that she said and then some. I think one of the things actually that writing my book and then, encountering the pandemic, particularly from the perspective of a disabled person, looking at how, all of these sort of triage protocols for COVID are just kind of leading us to this place of systematically like eradicating the disabled body, the body that, moves differently. It has really taught me that people are quite selfish, unfortunately. And I wish, that I could have had a different, more hopeful lesson on humanity. But I think actually the hope in that sort of lesson is that kindness and forgiveness are really, really radical acts. And they're particularly radical acts, I feel, in, the sort of hyper polarized, hyper activist, hyper fundamentalist society in which we are living right now. It's very easy to point out when someone has transgressed and, just sort of like, oh, dead to me, they're gone. I know Jael used that phrase earlier. I just remember that. And I'm like, it was not meant to be a dig against her, I swear. But that idea that like we sort of cut our losses and move on, I think is kind of a defining trait of society right now. And to be honest, I think it's quite prevalent in more liberal circles in which many of us move. And I really think that quiet, comparatively quiet act of forgiveness and sort of radical empathy for where people are coming from, and that belief in the possibility that people can change. Even though they, disappoint and they are fundamentally selfish, I think it becomes all the more important and something that, I really am really trying to hold on to. And, telling stories about people who struggle and who are selfish and make bad decisions in many ways, but who ultimately reach for hope because they can reach for hope together with other people. I think a huge message for me in writing the book. I was writing towards an experience of grief, and I think I was also writing to the community in many ways that I found with the Fold and with Jael. That I started writing this book in 2016 when I started working with the Fold, and back to your earlier question, Thea, I think so much about the Fold has shaped what that story became, because it really showed me what's possible when you do that slow, dogged work of change bit by bit and forgiveness bit by bit.
I love that. That's wonderful. We have 2 minutes to go, but there's one more question in the chat box that I want to know the answer to. So if I read it out loud to you guys, if you feel able, do you want to answer it via Twitter? Does that sound good?
Yeah, we can answer it too. It's fine.
Or should we just go for it? Just answer it.
One more
All
question.
right. So the reason why I wanted to ask you this question is because I have my own questions that we didn't have time for. And one of them was about, I was so interested in reading your novels, which I read very close together, where Jael was in Amanda's novel and where Amanda was in Jael's novel. I was like, which one of these edits was Amanda's? Things like that. So we have a question from Dorothy that says, one of you wrote about a mountain and the other wrote about a gutter. These are mirror images. And Dorothy has a really sort of thoughtful question where she says, did you use these physical spaces to represent hierarchies of power and powerlessness? Really interesting. But the second question she asked is the one that I really want to know the answer to, which is, given your friendship, did these mirror images rub off on each other?
I had not thought about it. This is a day of enlightenment.
Wow.
Today, somebody told me Elimina stands for eliminate. And I was like, what? Who knew that? I did not know that. So this is a new thing. I mean, I think it's interesting. Amanda, you can talk about the mountain part, but for me, the gutter was about being placed below and being valued below and lower, and having a space where people were living that was literally quite hanging off the edge of the mainland. And then there's also a hill, and the hill is sort of this more ideal place to live. So for me, I was playing with that physicality in the space. I was talking about the people who were in the lowest position, and also how do you get to that highest position if that's in fact where you want to go. So that physicality, that was where I was. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to keep me up tonight.
Yeah. It is so beautiful though, because it is so true. I think, for me in opposite ways, the physicality of the mountain, from the perspective of the physical nature of having to climb it and having mountains be, a difficult thing to climb for many people, not just disabled people, but also the work of sort of overcoming, if such a thing is possible, which I don't really think it is, grief felt for me very much like climbing a mountain by the time it's sort of there, and it's just like you have to keep going, and it's just one foot in front of the other, and it just seems to keep getting harder, and there's no end in sight.
It's interesting because it means in some ways both of us were writing about the lowest position and the obstacle of getting to the highest position, which I think is, to go back to the that title you gave all the books, the social
realist dystopia.
Yes, that. It feels like that could be like a constant in that category you made up, Thea.
I made up. You made it up.
You named it. Naming is very important.
But I think I love that what this question is showing us is that you are both working in tandem, maybe even when you don't know that you are, and maybe there's many ways in which we are working in tandem, both with friends known and unknown that we don't know we are, which I think is a wonderful way to end this event with Jael Richardson and Amanda Leduc. Remember that you can buy copies of Gutter Child and The Centaurus Wife at another storybook store. And thank you so much to everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.